Well, hello and welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into classic works of children's literature.
Well, the new alliteration for season 8, it's outstanding.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I was about to do our regular intro, just we've done it for 7 seasons, and then I was like,
Right.
Oh no, it's actually changed because Narnia is no more. Aslan destroyed it. And again, if people are frustrated with the lack of Narnia coverage that we have, again, blame C.S. Lewis, not us. He's the one who stopped writing these books.
We did every book we could.
Well, and funny enough, we'll actually later this season we'll be covering the Lefebvre fragment, which is that, I mean, technically if there was to be an 8th chronicle of Narnia, it would be kind of the remnants of the Lefebvre fragment, which is the book that started as The Magician's Nephew and then kind of stopped and then started again. So we will be covering that in a way, but that's not a full season's worth of material.
Right. I can only hope that one day one of the scraps of paper that I write on will be considered a sacred document.
Oh, yes, the people will podcast about.
That people will talk about.
This is the Wizenhunt napkin.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, Phil, there's probably many returning listeners tuning in here for season 8, but there might be some new listeners here with us too. But for everybody, this is kind of new territory, even for you and I, because for the last, 6+ years, we have covered the Chronicles of Narnia. We've walked chapter by chapter. We never even added up how many chapters there were.
It's roughly 15 or 16 times
15
7.
or so per. So yeah, so there's a well over 100 chapters that we've covered, right, on the show, getting close to about 150 episodes we've made. But the Chronicles of Narnia are over, and we are in kind of this limbo, if you will. That seems kind of pejorative if I'm like, this is the season of limbo. But this is a transitional season for us because, as we mentioned at the end of last season, we are going to continue to make a chapter-by-chapter journey through children's literature. We loved doing that with Narnia, and we want to continue doing that by going even deeper into kind of the canon of children's literature. And so we mentioned that, hey, next season, season 9, when we come back, we're going to be talking about George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, which we're really excited about. And just like we've done with the last 7 Chronicles of Narnia books, we'll go actually, I think we'll do 2 chapters at a time because the chapters are shorter, but it's about the same amount of pages for people who like to read with us. Be going about 15 pages at a time every 2 weeks, just like we always have done. But we actually decided to not do that in this particular season, right?
We needed to set the stage.
As
Put a few things in place.
Exactly. We were thinking about this. It's about 18 months ago when it really hit us that we would be finishing the Chronicles of Narnia. And, I mean, obviously we knew that from day one that they were going to end. But just like,
we didn't really know we were going to make it this far.
I think we always hoped we'd finish it. And then we thought we'd just kind of put it away. And then, we've enjoyed doing it so much, and we got so many wonderful emails and voicemails from people just saying, hey, and I'm talking like way back as we were getting to like Magician's Nephew, people who were like, please don't stop the show. We're really enjoying it. And not that we're necessarily at the whim of all of our listeners, but at the same time, you and I were reflecting, and we were thinking, it seems like the listeners like this, and we like this too. We don't really want it to end. We want to continue doing this.
It's also a pretty established habit.
I know. It's
we like hanging out.
Yeah, I mean, we never would see each other. If the podcast stops,
Right.
We're not going to see each other again.
Plus, we have all these expensive microphones.
What are we going to do with them now?
In this sound booth.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. The sound booth being my living room. This is actually the first time I'm recording. I've got a blanket on me here, a little Richmond Spiders blanket here, keeping me warm. We're really casual and comfy. So
Yeah.
just
if your 20s self could see you now.
Yeah. In case anyone is worried, oh wow, this season as a transitional season, we're covering some of Lewis's essays. We're going to be talking a little bit more about some academic works. If anyone's concerned of, hey, I go to Daniel and Phil not for any of the more academic, any of the more weighty things. I go to hear them joke and goof off and talk about weird prequel references, right? Then that's not going anywhere. That's still here. Again, I'm under a blanket right now. That's how not serious this. That actually seems like it could push people away. I'll take that back. That's just how not uptight we are.
I will say it's going to be a mix because Daniel is probably the most educated he's ever been at this
Doesn't
point.
that always happen? Like after
Yeah.
the next season, I'll be even more,
It's just fun. It's like when Apple says it's the best iPhone we've ever made. It's like, yes, it's a year later.
It should be, right?
Yeah, that's how that works. Of course.
Eventually, they'll just come out and say it's one of the best, and you're like, that's when you know.
That's when you know it's going backwards. I think that this is going to be a nice blend because you have quite an academic background at this point, and you're starting to give presentations at conferences instead of just attending them.
Sure.
But I am not. And I am having to.
I told you can come up there and just stand behind me if you want to. It's not.
I would love to give a talk, but I'm not sure people would appreciate it. I'm really enjoying the challenge of reading some of this stuff. For example, it used to be that I could prep by just reading a children's book, but the thing that I read today, I was at the library, and the library is across from this a fitness place that was blasted. It had the doors open. They were yelling, and they had microphones, and everybody's clanging around and stuff. And it took a significant amount of concentration to read this. And I ended up just driving home, going upstairs, turning on the sound machine, and focusing as hard as I could to get this this thing prepped. But I think that it's going to be the mix of me trying to understand and then you explaining with the more context that you have.
Sure.
That is going to hopefully make this accessible for people who maybe this is a little more of a reach, and then also provide some. It's going to be a reach for me.
Well,
it's
sure.
going to be a pushing, but I think it's also going to provide an outlet for you to share some of the more academic stuff that we had a taste of with Narnia, but didn't get to dive as deep into.
The impetus for this particular season, as we were kind of saying, we want to keep doing something. We think we and again, one of the questions we also get, I'll just say this right now as an aside real quick, because people said, will you return to Lewis? Are you going to ever read the Space Trilogy? And the big question we've just said is, like, we're not sure in the future. Are we going to return to, for the Space Trilogy, I mean, if the question is, are we going to return to Lewis? Lewis is going to be our Virgil-like guide. If you think about the Divine Comedy, Lewis is our Virgil-like guide through all of this. No matter what book we're in. When we go to George MacDonald, we picked him, right, because we're going to be looking at MacDonald through the lens of Lewis. So Lewis is still the fundamental part of this. It's the foundation. Jack Lewis is the foundation for this podcast, and that's not changing at all. But, so as, 18 months ago, as we're thinking, okay, where exactly do we want to go? I actually came across this particular paragraph that I wanted to read to you because it comes from Lewis's review of The Hobbit, which is published, both The Hobbit and this review are both published in 1937. And we were having deer time in my class, like the drop everything and read time. The rule is I don't always do it. Sometimes I break my own rules, but the rule is supposed to be the kids are reading, but actually I'm reading too. Like, I'm not lesson planning. I'm not sending emails. Like, I am also stopping and I'm reading. I am hopefully, right, setting that example, saying, look, it's important for me too. We're just learning how to love and enjoy reading and building that habit. And I picked up a book of lesser known Lewis essays, and I came across this review that was in it. And here's what Lewis says near the very end of his review for Tolkien's The Hobbit. So interesting. He says, "For it must be understood that this is a children's book only in the sense that the first of many readings can be undertaken in the nursery. Alice is read gravely by children and with laughter by grown-ups. The Hobbit, on the other hand, will be funnier to its youngest readers. And only years later, at a 10th or a 20th reading, will they begin to realize what depth, scholarship, and profound reflection have gone to make everything in it so ripe, so friendly, and in its own way, so true." This idea that only in a sense that the first of many readings can be undertaken in the nursery. As someone, professionally, I spend my time working really with students about 13 and younger. That's where I've spent almost all of my career. Is about 14, I guess, 8th grade and younger with students. And I'm really that's very purposeful. I'm very passionate about our youngest kind of learners when we think about education, right? And in that, it comes at one of these questions of like, well, what is the role that children's literature plays, right? Because I think often we get this sense of, is it, at least maybe I think about that, it's like, oh, it's just something that we build off so we can get to the good stuff, right? We learn how to, read about, Frog and Toad, or we learn how to read Dr. Seuss so that eventually we can enjoy Hamlet. And that's really, I have a tendency to this too, so I'm ragging on myself. That's really actually not the way Lewis viewed children's literature at all. And so the big question that I've been thinking through is, well, what exactly did Lewis think about children's literature? Because I trust him, right? And I trust both his scholarship and his wisdom. But at the same time, I also can just rely on my own experience. I mean, we spent 6 years, and our listeners with us too, maybe not 6 years, depending on how fast they listen to it, but some of them 6 years, right? Going through these 7 books and realizing just the strong, lasting impact that they've had on us. Right? So one of the questions is why? Why are these books, which most adults could read in a day or two, why do they have such a strong impact on us? And what's so special about them, particularly as a children's story? Why is it often that even today, we find many of us, especially I think those of us who are young parents, going back to the books that we loved as kids and realizing there's just something really beautiful and deep there. Not all children's books, but many of them that have stood the test of time. And so that was just kind of the question that I don't necessarily have an answer. We want to take this season as we think through. We want this podcast to continue. I want to keep diving deeper into children's literature. But before we do that, we've got to be able to actually ask the question of why, right? Why is it worth doing? Right? Often I think of myself, I sometimes, I don't know if you've ever felt like this. I feel like this sometimes, especially when I was a student, both in my undergrad and in my master's, where it'd be like time for me to write, even like when I wrote my master's thesis, when I already knew what I wanted to say and I knew why I thought it. And then I just had to find the research to back up my thoughts, which isn't always the best way to go about something, right?
Confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's like, all right, so here's what I believe. Where can I go find these things? And honestly, that's a little bit how we feel about this season. We believe that children's literature is valuable. And honestly, we think you, the listeners, do too, because you've spent this much time with us. It can't be just because you enjoyed Phil and I's company. There may be a few of you out there, but it probably was Lewis you kept coming back for. And so the question is, why? Why did you keep coming back to these books? Why do we keep enjoying them? How many of adults do I know that still go back and they reread Harry Potter, they reread The Hobbit, or what is going on that's causing us to fall in love? And it's not just nostalgia. I really believe it is not just nostalgia. And so that's part of what we're doing this season.
Yeah. Well, boy, do I have an essay for you.
Oh, this one we got today.
Yes.
So we thought we'd start off with on 3 ways of writing for children. So Phil, this is an essay that was published 72 years ago. 72 years, is that right? Yeah, 72 years ago here in 1952. Although I shouldn't say it was published. It was a talk first given in 1952. And it wasn't published, though, until 3 years after Jack's death in 1966 in Of Other Worlds. And I'll say this because we're going to cover about 4, maybe 5 essays this season. And all of them are, we'll tell you where to go. We'll put links to where you can find them in different books. And many of them are even found or easily accessible online as well, too. But they're also found inside of different collections of Lewis's essays. And this one is found in Of Other Worlds. And Phil, before we actually dive into the essay, can you give us a quick, for maybe someone's listening right now and they're driving in the car, they actually can't just, pull it up and read it right now. And they shouldn't. If you're driving, please don't do this. So give us a quick overview. What exactly is Lewis trying to talk to us about in this talk?
Yeah. He mentions that there are 3 ways of writing for children. And we're going to read those 3 main paragraphs in just a moment. One of them is what he considers a bad way to do it. And then he has 2 different good ways that he thinks it can be done. But to me, the main point of the essay is the magic of fiction that is not trying to imitate real life, but instead is a fantasy, involves things that kids are not actually going to do. We're not going to be swashbuckling pirates, and we're not going to be flying around or talking with talking beasts.
Yeah.
but that there is something necessary about that and something very helpful
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just as you mentioned, the essay starts, the first half of it, maybe about first third of it or so, is Lewis saying, it's called On Three Ways of Writing for Children, but really, Lewis spends the vast majority of the time talking only really about the third particular way of writing for children, right? In fact, if you, on the copies that you and I are reading out of, really, it's on the first 2 pages that he covers the first 2 ways of writing for children, and then there's about, 12 pages left on our copy of this third way of writing for children, and it does shift from not just being here's 3 different ways to write for children, but instead here is why I think this, in particular this third way, here's why I, meaning Lewis, here's why I went about writing this way. So Lewis even starts, the very beginning of the essay says this: I think there are 3 ways in which those who write for children may approach their work. 2 good ways, and one that is generally a bad way. Phil, can you tell us about that bad way, what Lewis has to say?
Yeah. Well, how about I read it out and then we'll discuss it.
That's great.
I came to know, this is Lewis talking. I came to know of the bad way quite recently, and from 2 unconscious witnesses. One was a lady who sent me the manuscript of a story she had written.
By the way, he doesn't actually say manuscript here. What does he write?
He says an MS.
An MS. I looked at that. I'm like, what is Microsoft doing in this story? Did you quickly come up with manuscript?
I did.
Okay.
But MS can stand for a lot of things, including MS.
Yeah.
So
there's all kinds of different, yeah.
I've always been confused about this. When there's a letter and then a long blank. Do you know what that is?
No, what is that?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to tell me something.
I've just assumed that they're tired of writing the same name over and over again, or that it doesn't matter, or they're trying to keep it a code.
Yeah, Lewis
Similar
does do
to
that
when
in some of his
when you say
letters.
like M's going down for the night.
Yeah, I do that for my kids.
Yeah.
That's just me getting. That's usually it is okay, but it's like if I'm saying M is going down for the night, that is me just like too tired to type out the rest of her name because I'm trying to get her to fall asleep. Like it's not like it's not like I'm writing by hand. I'm like, oh, us 21st century people, we can't even type the extra 5 letters, to make.
But also to me, MS does not stand for manuscript. Manuscript's all one word, right?
Yeah.
And so why would you? Yeah, just
I don't know, but he does.
It's a weird time to resort to texting, but maybe these are his notes.
Okay, yeah.
I know what a manuscript is. I'm
Yeah,
a
yeah.
published author.
That's true.
Okay, back to Lewis. One was a lady who sent me the MS, or manuscript, of a story she had written in which a fairy placed at a child's disposal a wonderful gadget. I say gadget because it was not a magic ring, or hat, or cloak, or any such traditional matter. It was a machine. A thing of taps and handles and buttons you could press. You could press one and get an ice cream, another and get a live puppy, and so forth. I had to tell the author honestly I didn't care much for that sort of thing. She replied, no more do I. It bores me to distraction, but it is what the modern child wants. My other bit of evidence was this. In my own first story, I had described at length what I thought a rather fine high tea given by a hospitable fawn to the little girl who was my heroine. A man, who has children of his own, said, I see how you got to that. If you want to please grown-up readers, you give them sex. So you thought to yourself, that won't do for children. What shall I give them instead? I know. The little blighters like plenty of good eating. In reality, however, I myself like eating and drinking. I put in what I would have liked to read when I was a child, and what I still like reading now, that I am in my 50s.
I love this from Lewis. He's like, no, I just liked it myself. It wasn't for the kids' sake.
Right.
So Lewis,
I love the word blighter too.
Oh yes. Lewis says this is a bad way of writing for children. He said this is not a good way to write for children. And again, he says, it's what he says is giving the public what it wants. He says both of them are trying to give the public what it wants. And he then goes on to even say children are, of course, a special public, and you find out what they want and give them that, however little you like it yourself. Why do you think he finds this to be such a, as we're thinking through the idea of stories that are enjoyed, maybe not even written for children, but stories that are enjoyed by children, why does Lewis find it really not helpful to simply give them what they want?
Yeah, I'll try. This it's difficult to put into words. I think that if you make something that you like, at least you have one person that you know is going to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is a little bit weird. It's similar to saying I only make art for myself. That just never really felt correct to me.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like I understand what people are saying, but I do think that it has to be for at least one other person.
Sure.
Otherwise, it just feels too odd. And I think there's a place for that if you're learning, but in general, I think that you make stuff for other people or at least one person.
Mm-hmm.
If you write a story for one, if you have one person in mind when you're writing that story, then I think you're going to make certain choices. But if you try to appeal to the masses, it has to be an average. It has to be reduced in a certain way because you can't please everybody. And so you're going to make all these choices and shortcuts, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just not going to come out very well. And there's no such thing as children.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I don't know how to tell you this. The past 3 years have been a lot. We were just trying to keep you busy. I don't think that there is one type of child.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think that you can write for, quote, children successfully.
They're more diverse than that.
Yes.
In a way. Okay.
And people are very different, and it just doesn't. I don't think it's ever really worked. If you come up with a formula for this is what people want.
Yeah.
This part reminds me very much of the way Steve Jobs would talk about product design. We had MP3 players before the iPod, but the iPod felt like something different. We've had plenty of cell phones, and we had cell phones with touchscreens, but there's something different about the iPhone, the way it was made and the way that it worked. And he said that he didn't like focus groups because people don't really know what they want, and it's going to reduce it down to this average.
Mm-hmm.
Henry Ford has a quote attributed to him. If I had asked people what they want, they would have asked for a faster horse, but he gave them a car. And again, he didn't invent the car, but he invented the car at scale with the assembly line.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. Because I was thinking in this first bad way. That's what Lewis says. He says it's a bad way of writing. Two things that stick out to me is one, that it's just disingenuous, right? To do this, be like, well, I don't even like this myself, but I think the kids will. And we always see this. You see this with people like, well, I think I mentioned when we recorded which we'll probably put that in our own feed at some point during the season. We recorded a Narnian retrospective with Matt Bush over at Pints with Jack. And one of the things I had mentioned, I don't even remember how it came up, but I had mentioned when it comes to like a movie night in the Payne family household here, one of the rules, right? I mean, there's certain rules like you can't watch R. The kids are 3 and 8 months, so obviously, like there's those kind of rules. And my son's like, I want to watch The Matrix. Like, no. Then there's other rules.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, sorry, buddy.
I feel like I saw The Matrix too late.
Well, I mean, maybe we won't make him wait till he's like 30 like you were, but we're going to, not 3, somewhere between 3 and 30.
Promise me that you won't make him watch the TBS version.
I won't.
Where Trinity says, shucks.
But one of the things I had said is, okay, we have rules like, content rules. Then one of the other rules is that, mom and dad have to enjoy it. Now, I don't mean enjoy it like it has to be only movies that we like, but it has to be movies that we are capable of enjoying.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm sorry, my son, cannot watch The Matrix as a 3-year-old. He also can't watch Paw Patrol the movie. I'm sorry. Like, and maybe I'm not. There's no shade to other parents showing that, but
you don't enjoy it.
I know, and I don't think it's well made. I think it's poorly made, just so that kids can sit still. There's some movies and some TV shows that do that. And like one of the rules is, no, it has to be something worth everybody enjoying. Now, there's some movies that he likes that I'm like, you know what, this is well made, but it's not for me. That's different, right? He loves the Cars movies. Okay, they are not for me. I do not enjoy them. However, I will
They
say
are well made.
they're decently made, right? Their voice acting is good in them. They look beautiful, right? And they do try to tell a story. They're not simply just sit your kid. They're not the best Pixar movies, but they're not sit your kid down and they'll shut up for an hour and a half or something like that.
They're not the best Pixar movies, but they're some of the highest grossing ones because of the toys.
Because the toys is
yeah,
big time. I mean that's the one that my
it funds the other movies.
exactly yeah. That's what my son's attracted to too, for sure, is part of the deal. But in that is, again, there's so many things out there, the Coco Melons of the world. You're about to get into this because y'all about to have your first kid too, where it's like you're just trying to give the kids what you think they want, just whatever will satiate them, right? And it's just disingenuous because it's not actually creating any kind of art or any kind, creating something that is actually worth enjoying, worth devoting your time to. It's something that's just there to grab your attention, or something that's just there to try to, okay, you're a kid, let me give you this. Here's your meal for the day, kind of thing. So I think that's an issue. And then the other thing too is, this kind of relates to it as well, is on top of that is trying to give kids what, or give, as Lewis says, giving the public what it wants. If the public here means children, children often don't want the right thing. I mean, any parent would tell you that. One of the things that's really interesting. This phrase has been going around a lot of more kind of very modern classrooms, and the idea of like, well, what we want to give children is voice and choice in all of their work. And obviously, us in classical education, that's not really our approach at all. And this is not a classical education podcast or anything like that. But the thing that I'm most interested in is choice. And there absolutely are places to give children choice. Like, to go back to the example I just gave of movie night. During movie night, Anna and I will give a little bit of choice to the kids, right? There's a kind of, okay, here's like, maybe 3 or 4 movies that are options for this particular night. There absolutely is room for choice, right? When when my son was, we were like, we're going to do maybe one special summer camp. Which ones do you think are, I mean, again, there are absolutely choices, but if we were just to say to my son, hey, we're going to give you a week and you can pick whatever you want to do, just like you name it, we're doing it. Like it's going to be, we're going to all eat ice cream till we die. Like that's going to be his choice, is eat ice cream until everyone's dead.
The old self-regulation method.
And so there absolutely is room for choice, but on the confines of the parental authority, right? And so just trying to give and again, that's an extreme example, but just trying to give a child what they necessarily want. Well, what they want is the same thing that Lewis says in The Weight of Glory. What they want is probably something much lower than what they really might enjoy. Lewis says this when he says, it doesn't seem that God, I'm paraphrasing, it doesn't seem that God is afraid of our desires, right? It seems our desires are too weak, not too strong, right? We go on, he says, like, an ignorant child making mud pies in the slum because we can imagine what is meant by a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. That's what Lewis says. The idea is not that your choices and your desires are inherently bad. It's actually your choices and desires aren't good enough, right? If you want to watch the Paw Patrol movie, I'm telling you, there's better movies out there. I'd love to show you some of them. It's not that you can't watch it because it's bad. It's you can't watch it because it's just not good enough. And so when we're thinking about writing for children or giving good literature to children, we don't want it to be just something that they think they want, because what they think they want might not be really what will ultimately bring them joy and some kind of depth, as we're talking now about on this show, transcendent truth, right? We want your desires to be stronger, not weaker.
Right. I'm amazed at the difference that it can make to understand which better things are available and how close they are. A kind of silly example is, after scrolling through any streaming service and not picking anything, I realized, for $6, I could rent almost anything in 4K.
Sure.
And I could watch exactly what I want to watch, instead of picking something that is just available this month or something. And it also makes me think of, I was completely fine watching stuff in 480p on VHS. And then DVDs came along and the picture was much better.
Yeah.
And I saw, my first thing on someone's flat screen. And then a little bit later, Blu-ray comes out. And then now we're at 4K. And you can actually see details in the movies you're watching. And that's not a perfect example, but just there is better stuff out there. But I was completely content with watching a blurry version of whatever movie I was trying to see.
Yeah. Well, let's move on, and we're going to fly by really quickly this second way of writing for children, because Lewis, he kind of points out this bad way, and then he mostly talks about his own way, but he does mention there's this other way, and it's related to the first way of writing for children, but he says it actually has a very distinct difference, and I'll go ahead and read what he has to say about this. He says, "The next way may seem at first to be very much the same, but I think the resemblance is superficial. This is the way of Lewis Carroll, Kenneth Grahame, and Tolkien. The printed story grows out of a story told to a particular child with the living voice, and perhaps extempore. It resembles the first way because you are certainly trying to give that child what it wants, but then you are dealing with a concrete person, this child who, of course, differs from all other children. There is no question of children conceived as a strange species whose habits you have made up like an anthropologist or a commercial traveler." He goes into more detail here, but he simply says, this is very different. Writing for a particular child is not the same, and you already said this, it's not the same as just writing for all children. Right. Yep. There's a concrete person in mind.
I learned this the hard way once I was able to travel outside of the United States, but I had always thought of things like an English accent, and I'm sure we used that phrase on the show before. But when you actually get to the UK, there's no English accent. There's no British accent.
Oh, sure, yeah.
There are very specific regional and even neighborhood dialects. And the way people say different things in different places, once you are aware of it, it completely makes sense. And then I also learned it by asking my friends who are from other countries, what is an American accent? And it was usually Valley Girl or a very southern drawl. But again, that does not capture what an American accent is because it's so varied. And I think this, it's very similar here where one child is going to have things in common with other children, but it's not going to have everything in common with every child. They're not all the same.
Yeah. But that's really all he mostly has to say about this second particular way. And then he goes into the third way. Do you want to read that for us, just a quick outline?
Yeah. I also love how he name drops Tolkien.
Yeah. And
As if we're
it's
not
funny.
friends and we're hanging out all the time.
If Tolkien doesn't get a first name here, he just drops him just by last name as if you know which one I'm talking about.
Right.
Which is funny. This talk is given in 1952, which means The Lord of the Rings has not been published yet.
Yeah.
Tolkien is obviously known in academic circles, and he is known popularly as the author of The Hobbit, but he has not written the Lord. He does not have the same level of fame that he'll have in literally just a few years.
What year was The Hobbit?
The Hobbit's 1937. This speech is given in 1952, and then Fellowship of the Ring comes out in 1954.
Ah, okay. The third way, which is the only one I could ever use myself, consists in writing a children's story because a children's story is the best art form for something you have to say. Just as a composer might write a dead march, not because there was a public funeral in view, but because certain musical ideas that had occurred to him went best into that form. This method could apply to other kinds of children's literature besides stories. I have been told that Arthur Meek never met a child and never wished to. It was, from his point of view, a bit of luck that boys liked reading what he liked writing. This anecdote may be untrue, in fact, but it illustrates my meaning.
Yeah, it just so happens that you seem to enjoy. I deeply feel this one as someone who spent almost my entire career in the 4th through 6th grade. I did a little bit of time, a little bit of work with 7th and 8th graders, but mostly kind of in the 9 to 11 to 12 year range. And, for me, a lot of it comes from it just so happens these kids are all into the same stuff I'm into. Like, it just works really well because my maturity level is about the same as theirs. And, I like the same things that they like. And and so I feel that. It just so happens, right? And what's funny is I used to say that in kind of a, making fun of myself kind of way. But I wonder if Lewis, as he's about to go on, I was just reflecting this past week, I wonder if Lewis would actually correct me and that, well, actually, Lewis, this is Lewis talking, saying, I think there might be something deeper happening that doesn't mean, oh, you're just childish. Because here Lewis says this is the third way, which is, this manner of it just so happens that a children's story is kind of the best form for telling this particular story, or that the story you're trying to tell just happens to be readily accessible to younger readers. But he kind of then veers off. The essay does make a shift here, and in that shift, Jack identifies this pathology that he says kind of holds on to most of us. And it's this idea that childhood is inherently something that we need to put away. We need to simply leave it behind. Lewis actually says this. He says, hence, a man who admits that dwarfs and giants and talking beasts and witches are still dear to him in his 53rd year is now, which by the way is how old Lewis is here, is less likely to be praised for his perennial youth than scorned and pitied for arrested development. It's interesting. Right? And right before that, he says something, now the modern critical world uses adult as a term of approval. Right? Saying that children or childish is kind of a pejorative, where adult means mature. And we see this in our culture even to this day, right? We've got, let's do this through the lens. This is very much a Lamppost listener kind of thing. Let's do this through the lens of Batman movies, right? The Batman movies have consistently become darker and darker and less kid-friendly over time, right? It's not a perfect straight line if you were to look at the graph from like 66's Batman with Adam West all the way to what's the most recent one? Who's Batman?
The guy from Twilight.
Yeah, I don't remember his name. Robert Pattinson.
Yeah.
Right? In that, I almost had to turn up the saturation on my TV to be able to see what was happening in the most recent Batman movie, which I did like, but, that one's very much not for kids at all.
Yeah, and I know because there were 17 kids in the front row.
Oh, no.
Throwing popcorn at each other. They got kicked out. They didn't have tickets, and then they snuck back in, and then they got kicked out twice. But they only talked during the quiet parts, which is
the most of the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, Batman has gotten dark over time and definitely less campy as well, too. Even in the Tim Burton movies, when you have Michael Keaton, they're still dark and weird, especially Batman Returns is wild, but they're still very campy and silly, and they get more serious and more adult, right? And again, this is again just one particular example, and I like most of these movies. Don't get me wrong; I love the Christian Bale ones too. They're wonderful, they're great, but we do see this in many things in our culture, which is that the idea is, in order for something to be taken seriously, we've got to make it darker, we've got to make it grittier, we've got to make it more mature, we've got to strip it of the childish things. In fact, we don't want people to think of us as being childish, right? If you're going to go see the Lego Batman movie in theaters, you're like, well, I need to can I find a nephew somewhere I can take with me? So I don't want to be there by myself because that would be childish. And this is what Lewis says, that, if you still have an affinity for these talking beasts, for giants, for dwarfs, for witches, he's like, really, you're not praised for being just youthful. You're scorned, right? For being immature. And Lewis, interestingly enough, he has 3 replies to this. He has 3 replies. And the first, he says, is a tu quoque. Are you familiar with this Latin logical fallacy?
No, tell me about it.
So it's a logical fallacy. It means you also would be a decent translation of it. It's a logical fallacy because, when I used to teach logic, we would talk about this. What it is someone that makes a logical point or an argument. You go, yeah, well, you do that too. And it's like, well, that's actually not the argument we're having right now, right? So you're attacking me and my own actions as opposed to the actual debate or the topic in front of us. But Lewis says that's exactly what I'm doing. And he says, very interesting. He says, to be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, well, these things are actually the marks of childhood and adolescence. He's like, the person concerned about looking childish is actually childish, because who is the most concerned about appearing mature? kids.
Right.
It's kids that are the most concerned with, do I look grown up enough?
Right.
Grown-ups don't care about this. And two ways this relates directly to Narnia, right, is that very first dedication in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is what Lewis means when he says you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again, right? It's very much what he's talking about here. And then the second thing is, this is the problem of Susan. This is Susan's problem at the end of the last battle, right? She hasn't been able, she's so focused on appearing mature that she's actually being the most childish because of that.
Right. I distinctly remember I was over at a friend's house. I was in elementary school, and I think I had gone to use the restroom, and I came back, and my friend was playing with a Star Wars ship and making the sounds and imagining that it was flying around. And I don't know if I told him to stop, or I remember thinking, we don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
We've grown up. We don't do that. But again, I was a child. And after I said it, I really regretted it because I felt like I had lost something.
Yeah.
And I had purposely gotten rid of it and then missed it.
Sure.
And I've tried really hard to both capture that back and allow myself to enjoy those things, but also respect that you only get this in that truly magical, it is your reality sense for so much time.
Yeah.
And so if we went over to, my wife and I went over to someone's house and we were playing Beyblades, and
nice.
You get on the floor and you play Beyblades and you take it super seriously and you do it for a long time.
You put knives on the end of them instead. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you got to sharpen them.
Yeah.
But just that is such a powerful time. And what I wanted so badly was for other people to come into that reality with me. And I can't quite fully get there. I don't imagine that the toys have minds of their own and that they're actually fighting each other. It's just, I know that they're just spinning tops, but that is an incredible time because you can suspend your disbelief so easily. You don't even know you're doing it.
And this relates directly to Lewis's second point here. But before I do that, I'll just give this one other really great quote. He says, the very way he ends up this, this tu quoque here, he says, "When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up," which is such a great, side remark there. But then he goes on to exactly what you're talking about, which is that, what we're not saying, and what Lewis is not saying is that just be childish all the time, and if people think you need to grow up, well, they're the ones who are childish. He's not making the Billy Madison argument here, which is no, just act immature all the time. No, instead, he talks about adding to the pleasure, just not taking it away. He says, arrested development consists not in refusing to lose old things, but in failing to add new things. He talks instead about enriching, right, what you enjoy. He talks about enriching who you are in your development. He says, I would not say that I have grown, but only that I have changed if I only enjoyed Tolstoy and Jane Austen. He says, and stopped enjoying fairy tales. Then it would just be a change if I gave up the fairy tales and only now read Austen and Tolstoy. But he says, no, I love my fairy tales still, along with Tolstoy and Austen, and because of that, it is development, it is growth. And then he says, often what we sometimes do as we grow up is we're actually not growing, we're literally just changing. And that the word growth would imply that we're growing from a past childhood, that we're adding on to the loves of our childhood. We're enriching them. Absolutely. You should not only read the Chronicles of Narnia. Even in Lewis's catalog, right? We would all say, if you haven't read the Space Trilogy, go read it. It has some depth to it, and it has solemnness in it that you won't find in Narnia just because it's got more mature themes and more mature characters. And so absolutely you should keep going, but don't then forget and say, well, I don't read Narnia anymore because now I've moved on to the big boy things, right? Right. Instead, it's enrich it with these other things too, but don't be ashamed. Don't fall away from those. I thought it was really interesting the way he looks at growth and changing.
Right.
He then goes on. He talks too about fairy tales kind of falling out of favor. Were you intrigued by this?
I'm always intrigued by something falling out of favor at a time period so far in the past.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to read this now. I don't know. You don't have Netflix currently, but
I don't know.
it seems like between Netflix and HBO and films coming out in theaters, almost everything is a variation of a fairy tale.
Okay.
And it's definitely more grown up, but there are more things about dragons than there
Sure.
have ever been.
It seems like it
before.
probably in the 1940s and 50s was a little bit less cool. And even like when you and I were growing up, if we're thinking about pop culture, which this is, we're thinking not necessarily about pop culture with what Lewis is writing, but that can be a pretty accessible thing for everyone to latch onto in the conversation. But like when you and I were growing up, you know, even things like Star Wars or Marvel, like they were popular, but they definitely were still the nerdy things.
Yeah.
Like the kids who played football at my high school could not have named 5 Avengers, you know? Like if you were to ask like our star quarterback, and this is not me ragging on the jocks or anything like that. I'm just saying, I'm just giving a kind of stereotypical example here. You know, who is She-Hulk? Like, you know what I mean? Who's Thanos, right?
They'd probably analyze it based on the root of the word.
Yeah.
Now, see, I went to an art school, so all the cool kids were the
Oh, that's
people
true. Yeah, it's
who-
different for you. Yeah. But the thing is that has changed somewhat in that, like, you know, the last 15, 20 years have been some of those things that are kind of nerdy, those fairy tale-esque fantasy things were quite popular. But like even something like Lord of the Rings was not super popular in my high school outside of like the kind of the nerdy kids. Not that it was, you know, people were teased or bullied or anything for it, but it just wasn't the thing that most people were all that interested in. But what's interesting is Lewis talks about, you know, it being out of favor. He says, you know, one of the reasons it's out of favor is it just kind of gets relegated. He says it gets relegated pretty much to be, you know, just like you take the old furniture you don't need anymore, and where do you put it? Well, you put it into the nursery. He says we do kind of a similar thing with these old stories. We don't really know what to do with them anymore. They feel too happy, too lighthearted sometimes. And so we try to kind of sort them out into being for children. And we won't get into all the reasons why he says this. He says, you know, one really interesting thing is he talks about, you know, the sorting out of books into age groups. He says, which is oh so dear to publishers. It has a very sketchy relation with the habits of actual real readers. That, you know, real readers don't often, for the most part. I think this is, you know, in the world of, unfortunately, the world like of TikTok and stuff, this is maybe not as true right now in this current kind of climate we're in. But you know, very few people walk into Barnes & Noble or their local bookshop and they're like, I'd like a YA book, please, right?
Yeah.
I do think that actually happens more now than it, but
I was going to say, but it's recent.
It's a
In the
recent
past
thing
10 to
right now. People are like,
15
let me go
years.
find the
Yeah.
new, you know, hot YA novel or whatever, you know, stuff out there. And again, this is not me ragging on you for reading YA at all. That'd be literally in, you know, opposition to the points that Lewis is trying to make. I would say don't only read that. The same way I'd say don't only read Narnia, right?
I'd also say that stuff that is YA is very different than what would have been considered young adult, even 15,
Yeah, and
20
some of
years
that
ago.
stuff, and I mean, that's a whole different conversation. Some of that's just like inappropriate. You know, it's just like throwing anything at the wall. You know, and it's not well written. A lot of the, not always. I'm not writing all YA, but sometimes a lot of the stuff that's kind of, and you see this can be, you know, they're almost kind of like Penny Dreadful kind of things. Of like you're just picking up kind of something that just is supposed to. Again, it's the again, I hate ragging on Paw Patrol here, but it's like the Paw Patrol or the Coco Melon of the literary world sometimes.
And this is going to be true of almost like everything is going to have the top 1% that is really good quality content, and then there are going to be a ton of imitations coming after it. Mm-hmm. If you look at all of sci-fi, everything sci-fi published in the past 2 years, a lot of it is decent but not great.
Sure.
But there are some really great things that are happening and coming out, and it's tough because you can't just sell one book. If you can't just sell the best stuff, if you did that, they would never try anything new. And I'm grateful that there is hunger for new things to come out. I almost called it content, but
you know,
I mean content in the old.
I know
older
what you
sense.
mean. Yeah, and so Lewis goes on here. It's really interesting. And he talks about, you know, one of the critiques and the criticisms of children's literature, and he then talks now particularly about fantasy, about the fairy tale. He says is that it gets accused of giving, you know, kids this kind of false impression of the world, right? he says it gives them this view of a world that isn't realistic, which I think, this is something that in the 1950s was true, and I think still even true to this day, even with our kind of heightened enjoyment of fantasy, kind of as a culture here, at least here in America, right? And I think in many parts of the West and around the rest of the world. But Lewis has this interesting thing to say about this, and I don't know if you remember in that episode we did with Dr. Marcos, way back in season 4, he mentioned this. He talks about the idea of school stories. So here's what Lewis has to say. Lewis says, I think no literature that children could read gives them less of a false impression, meaning fairy stories. I think what profess to be realistic stories for children are far more likely to deceive them. I never expected the real world to be like the fairy tales, but I think I did expect school to be like the school stories. The fantasies did not deceive me. The school stories did.
I've been waiting to get to this point this whole time. I am particularly susceptible to, quote, realistic things like this. For me, it's often in the form of movies. It was so hard to undo the things that were in my brain because of movies. And it could be sitcoms, it could be rom-coms, it could be dramas. I was so hungry for information that I think I recorded the wrong stuff because I was taking in inputs from everywhere. And the further I got into real life, I realized, oh, that was dramatic. That's on the screen for a reason. And they did it a certain way for a reason. And the most recent example is at the time of this recording, my wife and I are about to have a baby. We've been taking a lot of classes. And these classes have had to undo everything I've seen about childbirth.
Because of all the things you've seen on TV.
Because of TV. And I really thought we were going to have her water break and get to the hospital in 3 minutes flat.
Yeah,
because you have to get there. Well, it turns out most of the time the water breaks and then...
Or it doesn't even break.
Or it doesn't break at all.
A lot of moms,
And then maybe 12 hours later, you're still at home and you're not going in yet.
You're just watching TV waiting for the contractions to get close enough,
You're just waiting, and then you go and you might be in the hospital for another 24 hours.
Yeah.
Hopefully not. But or for some people, 72 hours because the water didn't really break it.
Sure, yeah.
It just all these things.
Or it's just Braxton Hicks. Come on. You have a hard time figuring out.
One friend, their baby actually kicked the water bag. It broke, but they weren't
didn't really count. It's like that wasn't. Yeah, that didn't count.
Later, the nurses told them your baby could have stayed in for 2 more weeks.
Wow.
It was not ready to come out, and that's why you've been up for 72 hours. But just undoing these things that were supposed to be realistic, but weren't. But again, the point that this doesn't exactly work is I also thought that you needed to be literally a knight in shining armor in order to meet the love of your life. And that just isn't really the case. But I do think there are so many good things that come from that. Chivalry, and there are a lot of good things mixed in there as well. But yeah, I was really fascinated by this point because I think that the closer it is, the more likely you are to believe, oh, this is how it really is going to be. But I never expected to be an actual pirate.
Sure.
I knew that was not... I had no examples of that in the real world to connect that to.
Yeah, Lewis goes on and he says, these school stories, which again, they're not inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with reading realistic fiction. I read a lot of realistic fiction, both for children, and I recommend many to students and to parents. They would say, hey, give me something else for my kid to read. I'm like, here's a bunch of great realistic fiction. I don't only recommend fantasy. I do recommend a lot of fantasy, a lot of imaginative literature, but not only that. Here's a great, realistic story. And some of them are modern too. They're not all old. But what Lewis does say about these school stories is he says its fulfillment on the level of imagination is in very truth compensatory. We run to it from the disappointments and humiliations of the real world. It sends us back to the real world undividedly discontented. For it is all flattery to the ego. The pleasure consists in picturing oneself the object of admiration. I think this is where you get first characteritis, or not main characteritis, right? Where you start reading stories like these, and what actually kind of begins to sit on your soul is the idea that you're the main character, because in these school stories, you are reading about the main character, but you're not the main character at your school. You're not the main character in your family, right? And obviously, there's main characters in, George and the Dragon. There's main characters in your swashbuckling pirates. But as you mentioned, no boy or girl in their right mind is really thinking, when they're even reading it as a 7 or 8-year-old, that's exactly who I am. Do they imagine? Do they pretend? Yes. But they don't actually think that. And so Lewis's argument here is that, well, it doesn't kind of lead them into there. Instead, it actually pushes them towards something greater. He goes on to say, it would be much truer to say that fairyland arouses a longing for he knows not what. It stirs and troubles him, to his lifelong enrichment, with a dim sense of something beyond his reach, and far from dulling or emptying the actual world, it gives it a new dimension of depth. He does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted. Let me say that one more time. That's so good. He, meaning the reader, the boy, he does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted.
Yeah.
He says he says that, stories that are not fairy stories, they're not fantasy, they're not real, they are realistic. They just don't have the ability to do that. Again, he's not saying that they are wrong or you shouldn't read them, but he's saying they don't have the ability to make everything a little bit more enchanted.
Right.
Right?
I remember my sister started going to a classical education school starting in first grade, and I would visit because my mom also taught there.
Mm-hmm.
And she kept coming home and telling stories about when they were playing in the 100-acre woods.
Yeah.
And I was so excited to see it, and I finally got there. And keep in mind, I'm at this point, still am, but 3.5 years older than her, so I'm seeing it from a different perspective. It was 5 or 6 pine trees and just like a little patch of mulch. And I was disappointed because I was picturing this grand forest, but to them, it was the 100-acre wood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that place was so magical. And I think one afternoon I played with my sister in this area.
Yeah.
And I got a little taste of it. And I also remembered, like in the past we would play at the creek, and it was a completely different world. And you're imagining these, 6-inch
mm-hmm.
piles of dirt as these giant cliffs.
Yeah.
And everything your imagination just runs wild, but it's fed by these stories. And I recently found out, when I was a kid, I had this argument with my dad about watching TV. And I thought I had lost, and I found out years later because he retold the story from his perspective, and I realized that I think I may have won. But I wanted to watch TV, and I also think read books and stuff, but that was more allowed. Mm-hmm. I did it because I wanted to fuel my imagination, so I knew what to pretend and play with my action figures or with whatever I had on hand. And I think that's what these stories do.
Yeah.
Is they give us that little bit so that we have something to build on. And it also just gives us, it shows us some of, quote, what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so grateful for that because it's still happening today. And it can happen in smaller ways and it can happen in big ways. But even reading something as dry and technical as a manual on programming, it shows me what's possible and gives me ideas to build upon. And it's a way of interacting with people across time and space because someone wrote this down years ago and now I'm reading it.
Sure.
And I can build upon these ideas, but they didn't get them from nowhere.
Yeah.
They didn't make them up. They're built on the foundation of other people.
That's good. So moving on, as we kind of get near the end of the essay here, Lewis ends by talking about another critique of fantasy or fairy tales in this kind of third way of writing for children, is that they're too scary. They're too frightening. And Lewis says, well, you could kind of mean this in one of two ways. Do you mean that it is potentially, giving kids phobias? He says that they're doing something which kind of gives you pathological fears, which are haunting, they're disabling. He says, one, I think that is wrong. You shouldn't do that. But two, I don't really think that stories can do that. He said, I think those phobias come from something besides stories. But he says this, so interesting. He says, if, though, you mean that you're trying to, if they mean that we must try to keep out of a child's mind the knowledge that they are born into a world of death, violence, wounds, adventure, heroism, and cowardice, good and evil, he's like, yeah, no, I don't agree with that at all. Absolutely not. He says, indeed, we would give children a false impression and feed them on escapism in the bad sense. And then he goes on to say probably the most famous line from this, which maybe many of our listeners might have heard, which he says, since it is so likely that they will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Since it is so likely that they will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. One final thing he says here too in that same paragraph. He says, let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. Nothing will persuade me that this causes an ordinary child any kind or degree of fear beyond what it wants and needs to feel. For, of course, it wants to be a little frightened.
Right.
But he says, this is good. He says, the world is a dark, despairing place. He even goes on to talk about, like, hey, when the kid hears something creepy in his room, do you want him to think that it be burglars, right? Or do you want him to think it might be dragons, right? Do you want him to think about maybe it is St. George who's there to destroy the dragon? Or is it more comforting to think of a police officer? And then Lewis says, I think St. George is more comforting than the police officers. I think the dragons are actually less frightening than an actual burglar. He says what these stories do is it helps kind of engage a young reader's imagination in a way that these other stories can't.
He also talks about, shortly after this, he talks about the exchange of, hey, if I could trade all these night terrors that I had as a child, and in exchange for getting rid of all of them, and they never happened, I also never had any fairy tales. He wouldn't make that deal. He thinks that it was worth having the fairy tales.
Absolutely. So how does he kind of wrap this up? Because that's just about the end. He does talk a little bit about modern. Do we want to talk about what he says about the what do modern children need? Sure.
What do they need?
Well, what's interesting is he says, as he's closing, he talks about, if we talk about what do modern children like, which is what the beginning said, that's the first way of writing for children. He says, don't do that. Don't just give them what you think they might like. He says another question, which might be a better question, but he still says it has some problems, is simply, well, yeah, but what do the modern children need? And Lewis says, again, this is not the right question. Right? Because the big problem here, he's like, modern children do need many things. Our own children need many things. But the question, he said, is kind of this question that assumes, he says something about like a superior attitude over a child. He said, the real question you should ask yourself is what moral or what do I need? So instead of what do the children need to know, it's what truth do you need to know? What truth do adults do we need to remember? Do we need to latch onto? What are we so quick to forget? And that's where I think Lewis, it's so wild. Again, it's 1952. He's not married yet. He does not live with any children, I guess, besides Miss Moore's daughter. But I think by this point, she's much further grown, obviously, at this point. And so I think she was closer to Lewis's age. So this is not a man who's around a ton of children. And yet, the ability that Jack has to just give this dignity, not wisdom, because he's not saying kids are wise, because they aren't. Everybody knows that. They're just not, right? They might be insightful every once in a while, and they can be absolutely, but they don't have wisdom yet. Now, it doesn't mean that all adults have wisdom either, but wisdom is something that often comes over time, right? What he's saying, though, here is the truth that exists for a child is truth that still exists for us today. So when we're thinking of morals, when we're thinking of ethics, when we're thinking about what is good and true and beautiful, what is all of that to an 8-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old should still be true to a 45-year-old, to an 85-year-old, right? And he says, so if we're going to ask questions about what modern kids need, that's not a bad question to ask, but the better question is, what do I need? Because whatever I need, well, certainly the kids need too. And through that lens, it's actually a lens of humility, saying, well, if they need to learn courage, They need to learn honesty or determination, maybe other virtues. Well, that's probably something I need to learn too.
Yeah.
Right? So the same thing else. Are we reading books that help stimulate that in our own lives, that help compel us to be more like that?
Or essays.
Yes, exactly. He doesn't know. This is where I did want us to end at. Would you tell me about how does he choose to end this essay? He gives a hilarious story here.
This is so wonderful, and it reminded me. It feels like this was more of a academic talk until this last little bit.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he reminds everyone who he is. And so he tells a story about how he said out loud, very loudly, "I loathe prunes." And then a 6-year-old from another table said, "So do I."
Yeah, they're at, he's like a dining room somewhere, like a hotel or maybe a restaurant or something. He's like, I hate prunes.
Yes. And just the way they connected on that, they didn't laugh. It wasn't funny to them.
He said something like prunes are not funny.
Yes, because prunes are far too nasty to be funny. And he describes this as the proper meeting between man and child as independent personalities, and that they're connecting on this.
Yeah.
On this point.
I love that. It's so fun. And what's great again is Lewis is he's treating children as complete people. They're not just, empty shells to be filled up with knowledge, to be filled up with ideas, or even morals. Like, they are complete people. Yeah, they have a lot of growing to do, but they are full persons. And he's saying, when he says that line of their independent personalities, he's recognizing that. And so he's saying, in writing for children, the way you do that is by recognizing that individuality in them. Look, hey, it's Lamppost Listener. We're back, season 8 here. I got to mispronounce some stuff, right? It won't be the first or the last time.
I'm sad you didn't get to say impertinent.
Oh, you wanted me to get that? I could impertinent.
Improbable and culpable.
But in that...
speaking of words real quick, what is OGPU? He says OGPU, Agpu and the atomic bomb. Do you know
I didn't know what that was either. I was hoping you could. I was going to skip over it because I didn't want to have to admit. I arrogantly did not want to admit the lack of my knowledge here.
Here's my next question. What do we know about this copy? Is there a chance that there are mistakes? Because there's definitely a quote in the wrong spot.
Oh, really?
And it could be that this way. You know what OCR is? Where they're taking pictures of text and then converting it to text in a computer.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's a smudge and it got converted to a quote.
Oh, could be.
There's some funny things, like I don't know what TOS is. TOS.
I don't know.
And some of these I'm like, are these British things or are these just typos?
Oh, it might be a typo. I also have my copy of the actual essay up there on the bookshelf. I did print these off though, but I don't know. I have to go back and look it up.
But I did enjoy all 6 pages. Two things per page. It's 12 pages, but I loved having a paper printout.
That's why I did it. I was
I was doing homework
I didn't want to write in my. I know I love annotating books, but I wanted to make a ton of notes, so I did print it off, and I didn't write it in my actual book there just because I had a lot of notes here. But let's end with that. With this 3 ways of writing for children. I think this is a great way for us to start off this season because hopefully you and I feel better about this, and I hope that our listeners do too. We start to get a sense about the importance of writing for children. We see the ways in which there's just a richness and beauty that can be found in children's literature, right? And what's so exciting is more so than literature maybe that's written for adults is it can be even more accessible, which doesn't just mean, hey, it's easier to read. It means sometimes the truth is easier to comprehend. There's certain books that are beautiful and have such depth and richness of themes in them that are obviously written for an older audience, but sometimes it's harder to get through some of those themes because they're just dense books, whereas something like Narnia we can find those themes so easily. They're much more apparent to us, especially as adult readers. So I think it's a great place for us to end. I'm really excited to look at a couple more essays throughout this season. Let's finish. We've got
Your kombucha's kicking in.
Oh, the kombucha's getting a little wild over here.
You drank a fourth of a kombucha.
We've got an email here. It's an email that came to us. Believe it or not, came to us. I've been holding on to this one, Phil.
The day that we ended Season 7.
This came to us on the day that we released the final chapter of The Last Battle. And it was, believe it or not, also the first email that came to our new email address, hello@lampostlistener.com.
That's hello, HELLO, not hello.
Oh,
like
yeah,
the British spelling.
So for our UK listeners. This is an email from Karen Jones. And do you want to read this or do you want me to read it?
You read it.
All right, I'll read it. Comes to us from Karen Jones. Again, came the day we released that episode, which is really fun. It's called A Bittersweet Conclusion. Karen says, Dear Phil and Daniel, hello. I'm a history graduate student who has listened to your podcast since the beginning of my undergraduate senior year in 2022. I had been working on my senior history capstone when I decided that I needed to consume something other than the many books and articles on Anglo-Saxon and American colonial law. While searching for an audio version of the Chronicles of Narnia, I came across the Lamppost Listener and decided to listen to an episode. I just want to pause for a moment. This has actually happened a couple of times. I don't know if this is exactly what Karen is alluding to, but because our episode titles would legitimately be like, The Silver Chair, chapter 1, whatever. Yeah. Whatever, I don't remember the name of the first chapter. It's called The Wrong Door. No, that's The Magician's Nephew. Whatever it's called. People sometimes would be like, oh, I assumed it was just like the audio book for free on the internet, and then they click it, and then they're stuck with us.
Highly illegal.
Yeah, which we absolutely do not do, because you can't do that. But people have think just like, all right, I guess I'll listen to these guys. Karen goes on, though. She says, from that moment, the Lamppost Listener became a part of my daily college routine until I caught up, that is. Thank you to you both for the work you have put into this podcast, including the outside reading, the guests, and the insightful commentary you brought. My first introduction to Narnia, outside the 2005 movie, came around when I was 8 years old with the silver horse and his boy. Sorry, just the horse and his boy. Since then, I have read through the Chronicles an astounding 30 times.
Holy cow.
I used to read through the series 4 times a year. Though I had understood the Christian themes of the series and even the Platonic references in The Last Battle, your podcast allowed me to see even more profound intellectual and religious traditions woven throughout the pages.
We should put that on a billboard. Even if you've read the books 30 times,
you'll still enjoy the show.
We still have something to say.
Furthermore, you succeeded in convincing me to read the Chronicles in publication order, which I did just before beginning grad school. Doing so was like reading the books for the first time. I saw connections I had never seen before and understood Lewis's intentional prose in a more meaningful way. For instance, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe had always been my least favorite of the series, primarily because I always read the faster-paced Magician's Nephew right before it. Reading The Wardrobe first showed just how masterfully Lewis introduces the reader to the characters and the world of Narnia. Moreover, reading the books in publication order gives a more accurate depiction of Aslan's progressive revelation to the children, similar to how the ordered canon of Scripture presents a progressive revelation of Jesus Christ from the, here's a big word for you, proto-evangelium of Genesis to the final judgment and consummation of history and revelation.
Wow.
Do you want to know what that word means?
Is it similar to anti-disestablishmentarianism?
It is not. Proto.
Is it the first example of telling others about Christ?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Nice.
Well done. I do apologize for the lengthy email. No, not at all, Karen. We love emails. They're great. They're wonderful. She says, we historians can be a bit long-winded at times. However, having just finished the final episode of The Last Battle, I wanted to convey the influence your podcast has had in my perspective of Lewis and Narnia. While this portion of the podcast sadly has ended, I look forward to your next season. May the Lord bless and keep you. Further up and further in, Karen A. Jones. This is P.S. Wait a second, Phil. Wait a second. You mentioned Caspian's wife as having been unnamed in the Chronicles. I believe the movie adaptation of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which we all rightfully like to forget, calls her Liliandil, a name reportedly coined by Douglas Gresham. I actually think we heard about this. I don't think we've ever mentioned on the show. I think Douglas Gresham told us this.
Yeah, it sounds kind of familiar.
Liliandil. That sounds very Narnian. I like that quite a bit. So. Yeah. It's a good reminder because I totally had forgotten about that. So now you can respond to Karen's email.
And that was in the BBC version?
No. That's in the 2010 version.
2010 version. Well, thank you, Karen. That was really fun. 30 times is really impressive. If like you were saying, people can read the entire series in a day, maybe it was in a month.
Oh yeah, I mean they're not difficult. Anna was just reading one of them recently. I don't remember which one it was. I think she's reading Caspian recently. And she read it in just a few days while also working full time and, taking care of 2 kids and stuff. And it wasn't, like most nights she would just read it in bed until she pretty much fell asleep.
Yeah.
And, they're not, it is funny because you and I have spent so much, we
us
went
6 years.
so slowly through them.
Yeah.
Right. But they're really accessible in that way. So why don't you end this episode for us? Because we'll be back with, not chapter 2, but we'll be back with episode 2 of this season in just 2 weeks.
Right. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can listen to a bonus episode each month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Ashton Washburn, and Ender Trophy for supporting us at our top tiers.
And you did just send out one of those rewards. I mean, it's gotten to all these listeners, obviously, by the time that they hear this episode. But you did it's probably my favorite illustration you've done for the show.
Oh, thanks.
You did Prince Rillian as the Black Knight in the Silver Chair. Fantastic. Maybe we'll find like a watermarked version. I'll just drop it down in the episode so people can look at it, because it is really spectacular work, and it's exclusive to people who support us at the highest tiers on Patreon.
That's right. Yeah, it's a top tier reward. I actually spent a lot of extra time on it because I had a specific vision and it took some time to get there. If you'd like to contact us, you can mail us at P.O. Box 25854, Richmond, Virginia 23232. You can also email us through hello@lamppostlistener.com or call us at 406-646-6733. Links to past guests, reference books, and other things are also at that website, lamppostlistener.com. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and until next time, further up and further in.